So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new interview organized by HEMRIP, which means Multidisciplinary Study Group on Religion and Public Advocacy, Grupo de Estudios Multidisciplinarios de Religión e Incidencia Pública. My name is Elio Rego, and I am the organization's Publications and Research Coordinator. Today, I have the honor of introducing to you Professor Elizabeth Shakman Hurd from Northwestern University. Hi, how are you?
Good morning, I'm well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your willingness and time to be with us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
I'll briefly introduce Professor Hurd's impressive academic career. So, Elizabeth Shakman Hurd is Professor of Politics and Religious Studies at Northwestern University. She teaches and writes on religion and politics, on the politics of human rights and the right to religious freedom, the legal governance and religious diversity, the US foreign relations, and the international politics of the Middle East. Her work pursues an integrative approach to the study of politics and religion that offers insight into dilemmas of national and international governance involving difference, power, law, and pluralism. So Professor Hurd is the author of The Politics of International Relations, The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, that it was published in 2008, and Beyond Religious Freedom, the New Global Politics of Religion in 2015, this one. So both published by Princeton University Press, and she also is co-editor of Politics of Religious Freedom and Comparative Secularism in a Global Age. So currently she's working on a book on religion and politics on the American border. So I'm gonna read the question because I'm still working on my English, but still I think that we can have like a good conversation in this hour maybe that we're gonna talk. So I would like to ask you first about your first book, that is The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, this one, because there you analyze the commonly discussed notion of secularism, which has been understood as the assumption that religion is a private affair, or as the narrative in which religion is strictly separated from politics, especially in the theory of international relations. So can you explain to us how you define secularism?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The short answer is that I don't ever define secularism outside of a specific historical context. So secularism is a language of politics. It is a language of politics in which very specifically people talk about the proper place of religion in public life, in our laws, in our institutions, and so on. And so the question of secularism requires going to a specific time and place and saying, who is making claims in the names of this political language? What groups are claiming to be secular and for what reasons? And oftentimes you'll see common threads or common family resemblances between languages of secularism in different contexts in different countries. So you often see a claim, as you said, religion is a private affair. You'll see claims that religion is something that with modernization is overcome or left behind. You'll see claims that religion is something that is kept up, that should be kept apart from public life in various forms of governance, such as law and other collective forms of governance in our institutions. All of these claims are made in the name of secularism and in the name of secularization. What I was trying to point out in my notion of secularism is, first of all, how historically contingent, meaning how much these definitions and claims change depending on where you are and what the context is in which they are being made. So for example, in France, laïcité is a very strong anti-clerical claim that comes out of a very particular antipathy toward the Catholic Church as it was embodied, and it remains embodied in the French Republic in various ways. And this goes back to the Revolution and of course, the 1905 law, when it became formalized legally in France. And it's a very specific history. And so to talk about laïcité in France is to talk about a very specific history. So I'm interested in those specific histories in my first book. And you can see on the cover that there are different definitions or translations of the word secularism in some of the languages that are spoken in the countries that are discussed in the text. And my effort in doing that was to tell the reader or give them a signal or a hint. Look how different these words are, and each of them could be translated in many ways into English. For example, the word in Arabic could be translated as worldliness, and that's oftentimes how secularism is translated, which has kind of a different inflection than the word secularism or laïcité or laiklik in Turkish, which has this very powerful association with Ataturk, with the founding of the Republic in the 1920s, and so on and so forth. So my intention here was to say, look, we have hardly even begun to grasp how complex, how historically contingent, how rich, and how politicized, deeply politicized this language of politics is, which we're calling secularism. Because again, secularism is a language in which we speak about religion, right? It's a language in which we define it. We say it should be here, it should not be here, it should be this, it should not be that. It's something that belongs to him, but not to her, and so on and so forth. And so it's a very deeply political process to determine where those lines should be drawn. What counts as religion? What counts as culture? What counts as religion? What counts as politics? And so on. What counts as religion and what counts as fanaticism, for example? Where do you draw that line? Who draws that line? How are those people, what is their presumption to authority, and how do they relate then to the institutions of power? So those are the kinds of questions that I was hoping to put on the table. I also had a strong emphasis in that book on the global aspect of secularism. That is to say that secularism is not simply something that falls out of the sky, but rather is carefully and deeply embedded in global politics, to the extent that, for example, you can't really understand European colonialism in North Africa and the Middle East, which was one of the areas I focused on, without understanding the ways that secularism was posited as a solution to the problem of being pre-modern or not modern enough for political independence. So the ideas in Tunisia, for example, you need to secularize, you need to go through these processes that Europeans went through before in order to become modern, in order to become capable of self-governing, as opposed to having a colonial authority looking after you and looking over your shoulder. Now, all of those processes are very much wrapped up in the history of European colonialism and European assertion of power and authority over other peoples and other societies. And so there's a sense in which this is also a global discourse that is used to assert authority, to lay claim to modernity, and to lay claim to privilege, to decide for other societies how they should organize their public laws and institutions. And so I don't want to suggest that there is only one way in which that operates, because it varies from one context to another. And obviously, the local peoples in these societies also have their own understandings of what the relationship is between majority and minority, church and state, religion and politics, mosque and state. And all of those histories are very rich and need to be a part of the conversation that we're having. And so the second thrust of the book is really to suggest that this is a question that needs to be considered globally, rather than exclusively as a Western European Christian invention that solved the problem of religion, which is certainly the story that it may tell of itself, but is not the reality that we're seeing lived out when we study what's going on in the world.
So talking about the context that you are saying about, it's really interesting, the notion of secularism and how it's translated into Spanish too. Because in Latin America, I told you that we use like Estado laico or
Sí.
Estado secular. So there is also like a kind of distinction there. And there is a concept that you mentioned in your book that is like the Judeo-Christian secularism. Can you tell us more about it? Can you explain what does involve?
Yes. So well, first of all, this book was written 20 years ago. So let me say that I think these concepts need to be refined and can always be improved upon. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding about what I meant by Judeo-Christian. People seem to get the laicist piece. Laicism was this separationist, Jacobin, allergy to religion, push it out. That was the driving impulse. Judeo-Christian secularism is a way that I was trying to access something rather different, which is this discourse that is related to what I was just talking about with the European colonial context, in which there's an understanding, and to be clear, it's not an understanding that I share, but this is diagnosing rather than prescribing. I'm describing what I saw around me. An understanding that the West, because of its Christian, and then Judeo-Christian, of course, was added on after the Second World War with a lot of hesitation. And there's still a lot of hesitation about that hyphen between Judeo and Christian, to be clear. That's why I think this needs refinement. But there is a sense that the Christian West somehow spawned or somehow led to the creation of secularism, a particular kind of secularism that kind of emerged naturally out of Christianity. And therefore is always indebted to and in relation to Christianity. And there is an element of truth to that narrative, I think. And I think Charles Taylor, for example, in A Secular Age, tells that story quite convincingly and with a lot of historical data, you could say, to back up the argument. But there's also a sense in which the Judeo-Christian claim to a secularism that is founded on our culture and our civilization reproduces a series of exclusions. Exclusions, for example, of indigenous people in the US, exclusions of Muslims, exclusions of atheists or those who claim no religious identification. And those series of exclusions and that claim to this foundation, to this Judeo-Christian supremacy and this kind of sense of we have achieved it, I think has been a very powerful language in which we've spoken about religion and politics in the US, and perhaps to a slightly lesser extent in Europe, where the laicist discourse, and perhaps also in Chile, although I'm not sure, I would like to learn, the laicist discourse has been quite powerful in terms of a very strong anti-clericalism. So these two models that are introduced in my first book are really ways of saying, look, we need to unpack different trajectories of secularism, different ways in which it's taken shape and form, and the kinds of resonances that it gathers in a particular context. How does it justify itself? What claims does it make? How are they made? And in some cases, they're made in an anti-clerical mode and mood. And in another case, they may be made in a much more triumphalist mood of Judeo-Christian or Christian supremacy. And I think both of those moments are very powerful. And there are probably others as well, but I was focusing on these two in this book.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of this kind of influence of civilization, especially the Christian civilization. And in your book, this idea of Judeo-Christian secularism is mostly influenced by Protestant inheritance, especially in the United States. So also you analyze how the United States has been built upon principles of democracy, freedom, and this idea of a shared adherence to a common religious tradition. So how can we understand that link between religion and democracy, or to what extent the Judeo-Christian tradition leads to democratic principles?
Right. So this was exactly at the important point where I think that the argument requires clarification. I think that in the mythical self-presentation of Judeo-Christian secularism, or this claim to the Christian origins of democracy, of secular liberal democracy, I think that that story needs to be put in context. There are a number of research projects that have attempted to show or to prove that indeed Christianity leads to democratization, or there are particular proclivities built into Protestant Christianity that spurred or sparked the Reformation and led to these processes that we now associate with liberal democracy in terms of the forms of governance. My point is that this is a story that it needs to be put into context, and that actually there are many different ways that many different societies, not just Christian ones or Christian majority ones, there are many different ways that societies have found ways to coexist democratically. And the relationship between democracy and democratization and religion is not one that we can map. It is just simply too complex. And to suggest that religion either leads to or obstructs democracy is to really try to put all of these very complex histories into a simple formula and then stir them up and serve them to the public. And I think that does an injustice to the public. I think people know that religion is not one thing and democracy is not one thing. And you cannot simply say religion does or does not lead to democracy. You have to look at the context. You have to look at foreign intervention. I mean, look at Chile, look at the role of foreign intervention in terms of democratization or lack thereof. Think about the complex ways in which various religious actors and traditions have been mobilized for all kinds of different purposes. We really can't say that it does or doesn't lead to democracy. It's just too complex. And so I'm very hesitant with anyone who wants to sell or peddle their theory that religion does X, Y, and Z, and that we can plug in the variables and then have our outcome, and that it will map cleanly onto these different societies and different times and different places. I think that people deserve to understand more with more nuance and more fidelity to the complexities of human social life, the ways in which religion and democracy interact in very, very different ways depending on the context. So the book is an effort, although I don't focus on democracy, it is certainly an effort to question those who want to posit an easy relationship and say, well, if a society modernizes or if a society becomes Christian majority, then it's more likely to become democratic. No, I think that we need to tell a different story.
Yeah, totally true. And then you profundize, you go deeper in that argument in your second book, that is this one, Beyond Religious Freedom. And in this book, you discuss this construction of religious freedom discourse in world politics, right? So what do you mean with beyond? Because I think that word makes a difference there. What does beyond suggest in this context?
Well, that's a great question, Ellie. I think that beyond religious freedom is an attempt to gesture toward the central, or one of the central arguments of this book, which is that if we focus exclusively on religion, or what we define as religion, whatever gets defined as religion by those who have the power to define, which is the real power, right? If we focus on religion and religious freedom, we lose sight of a whole wider context in which the promotion and advocacy and legalization of religious freedom is taking place. And I have a series of examples in the book that describe what it looks like to take this very different perspective and to locate religious freedom not as a stable, singular, unalloyed good that can simply be exported from the United States, which understands itself as kind of the source and the fount of religious freedom, Not that, but rather that religious freedom is a deeply political, at least when it becomes globalized, but at home as well, as we know, a deeply political and politicized language in which certain interests are inevitably privileged above others. And those gaps between the religious freedom that gets promoted and gets legalized and becomes a part of public life and government advocacy, and that sort of formal religious freedom may be very, very different from the forms of spirituality and the forms of sociality and solidarity that are happening on the ground, what I kind of call lived religion, which is a term from Robert Orsi, my colleague at Northwestern in religious studies. And so what I try to do in the book is say, let's take apart, let's disaggregate the term religion, and for that matter, freedom, and let's tell a very careful story about what we actually mean when we say we're going to promote something called religious freedom. And it actually turns out to be, I think, although I don't say it quite so baldly in the book, a colonial language, a impositional language of politics that wants to assert that the US has found the answer to the problem, and now we're going to show others how they should live. And that kind of colonial impulse is quite similar to the impulse around secularism that I described earlier, where we have societies who claim the mantle of civilization and the mantle of authority and the mantle of righteousness, and then seek to export that and to share this with others, which may sound good at first, but when you situate it in the context of imperialism, you will understand immediately that there are a lot of interests involved in these assertions of power. And religious freedom and its export and its globalization is a power-laden discourse. And this book actually tries to unpack some of those specific power dynamics and get people to say, look, what if we were to look beyond religious freedom? What if we were to consider just for a moment leaving it behind? What would it look like? What would it look like to organize ourselves as a society, as a community, without religious freedom? What would it look like? Would there be another language of politics that we could imagine that would allow for pluralities of ways of life, ways of being in the world, understandings of human relations with each other and with the gods? Are there other ways to even imagine this? Or is this language the final solution? And I'm afraid that it's not, and that it actually carries a lot of dangers. Anyone that asserts to be the final solution is dangerous. And I find religious freedom to be quite dangerous in many circumstances because it is so self-important, and it presents itself as having solved the problems of religion and diversity. And I think it actually creates a lot of the problems that it proposes to resolve.
Yeah, you mentioned this idea or this concept of lived religion, but you also developed two other concepts, that is expert religion and governing religion. Can you explain those categories, and what do you mean when you say that religion should be dethroned as a singular and stable category?
Yeah, so this is really kind of the central thrust of the book, is to say, what I would like my readers to do is when next time they pick up the newspaper in the morning and they see that there is a story that talks about religious violence, say in Myanmar or some other country, that the reader says, what do they mean by religious violence? And how can we understand what is going on in this situation, not by excluding religious factors or institutions or authorities, because of course they're a part of the picture and they're intermingled and interwoven, but rather by understanding all of the factors involved. And one of the things we need to do in order to see why that's necessary is to what I call dethrone religion or disaggregate religion, or basically to try to understand that when we often don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about something like religious violence or religious reconciliation. that it's very unclear. And so one way that I tried to prove that point or drive that point home was through these three different faces of religion. There's expert religion, lived religion, and governed religion. Whenever you develop heuristics like this, it's risky because people say, oh, I don't know. I think there's more overlap between these. And I say, yes, yes, there is overlap. And then they say, well, I don't know if there is, you can't even have such a thing as lived religion because lived religion is itself shaped by expert religion and governed religion. Yes, of course. So let me say at the beginning, all of these categories have porous boundaries, and yes, they all shape each other. The idea was simply to point the reader toward the enormous amount of work that we make the category of religion do for us, and to say, look at all these different aspects of life that get kind of dumped into religion. So for example, with lived religion, we have, as a broad category, all the kinds of everyday experiences that ordinary people have in their communities relating to the forms of what we can call religion, everyday religion, as cataloged by an enormous array of religious studies scholars. I mean, people like Susan Ammerman, people like Robert Orsi. And then we also have expert religion, where you have judges and policymakers talking about religion and making decisions about who, for example, has religious rights in a particular situation, who in the United States case benefits from a religious exemption, for example, through the ministerial exception. You have all of these bureaucrats, judges, officials speaking about religion in different ways. And that's a very different thing from what grandma's doing at the kitchen table, right? That's just a different thing. Then we have governed religion, which I think is very much kind of overlapping with the expert religion, but you have the sense of looking at the ways in which religion is produced as a category. There's actually a new book that speaks to this so well, I could just mention it, and it is by a Norwegian scholar named Helge Arsheim. And Helge Arsheim is looking at religion at the UN, at the United Nations. And he's looking at 4 different committees there and looking at the extent to which religion is actually made as a category through their negotiations, their discussions, their deliberations at the United Nations. They actually produce a particular understanding of what religion is and legally then try to regulate it internationally. And that process is interesting to look at. But that's also another thing that's very different from the bureaucrats and from grandma at the kitchen table. And so we have this sort of enormous array of human practices, assertions of authority, forms of governance. We also have of course, in their expert religion, we have all of the religious authorities who are speaking on behalf of their communities, who are asserting their position in a particular hierarchy to speak on behalf of their people. All of this is going on, and it's an immense and complicated field. And my point was just to say, what does it mean then to promote religious freedom when religion is itself obviously this immensely complex construct, this immensely complex reality and part of human sociality? It's very, very difficult. And it's very, very much going to depend on who gets to define religion and who gets to define freedom, right? And so I spell this out through a series of case studies in the book that look at how this plays out in, for example, the ways in which communities nominate leaders, or leaders self-appoint to be the representative of a certain community, leaving out other voices. And those who are left out, they don't have religious freedom, but the community may see itself, or the leaders who are in charge do speak for the community, and they say, we have freedom. So who has freedom and who doesn't is, these are deeply politicized questions. And so the book is an attempt to encourage people to ask more of these questions in other contexts, including in the Chilean context, which I think is so important. And I think I know from having talk to some Mexican colleagues like Roberto Blancarte, for example, that there's a vigorous and vibrant debate in the Spanish language literature around these questions. And I think that that has not been reflected adequately in the English-speaking conversation. And so I think it's really important to ask some of the same questions and expect to get different answers in the Chilean context. And I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Well, there is an interesting observation in your book that the public and political discourse show two polarized phases of faith. On the one side, there is the bad faith, which is understood as the dangerous and violent side of religion. But on the other hand, there is the good religion, the side that promotes peace, justice, solidarity, and so on. How does this discourse work and function in this relationship between religion and politics?
Yes, this is another thread running through Beyond Religious Freedom that is really important. I'm glad that you picked up on that, Ellie. So the idea is I was looking and studying and reading and also traveling and attending a lot of different conferences where religion and religious freedom was at the center of attention. It was the main question on the table. And I found over and over in so many different and diverse contexts, this dichotomy between good religion and bad religion, that this dichotomy was so powerful in shaping how people understood religion and politics. And that the way that it works is a simple formula. And because it's so simple, I think it became very, very powerful and compelling because it's easy to understand for policymakers, right, who don't think about religion, who never thought about it and don't want to maybe. And so here is the formula. We identify good religion and then the government supports them. We boost them up. We support them with financial support, with the energies of our various government offices. We create offices to support these good religionists. We find the bad religionists and we either reform them through programs that will turn them into good religionists, or we push them out. We get rid of them. We bomb them until the morale improves, right, is the expression. Like this is the attitude about, this is how people get categorized often as terrorists, the bad religionists. And everything, again, gets put in the religion category in terms of causation. So people who are terrorists are bad because their religion is bad, and therefore they need to be obliterated or reformed, rather than stepping back and saying, what are their complaints? What are the problems that they actually have? And so the good religion, bad religion binary is just a very simple way to understand the world, to try to divide it up. And I think, again, it ends up creating an oversimplification. It also creates a situation where it becomes way too easy to solve problems by just having the government step in and give a bunch of money to people who they decide are moderates. And in many cases, of course, the moderates are the pro-Americans or the people who want that pipeline to go through on behalf of the Chinese, or the people who won't say anything at the UN about the Uyghur camps, or the people who don't want to stand up. All of these political, economic, geopolitical interests are at play. And so the good religion, bad religion dynamic is a mask, and it is not actually reflective, I think, of the realities that are just beneath the surface.
So this is like a follow-up question, because at Henry, we are working precisely about these kind of issues with the civil society organizations in international fora like the OAS, that is the Organization of American States. So we have seen this idea of religious discourse within international politics, mainly driven by the United States. In this respect, it's very significant that over the last month, a resolution of religious freedom has been reviewed by the OAS. But nevertheless, from the start, the debate has been trying to introduce a particular notion of religious freedom that is determined by evangelical and pro-life groups that advocate against gender rights, abortion rights, for example, or same-sex marriage. So in other words, they try to promote a certain judeochristian morality under this flag of religious freedom. So when religious discourse create these tensions among civil society groups, how can we build bridges between the different voices discussing religion and politics, and especially in those spaces where these ideas of government and expert religion prevail?
This is a great question, and you're really getting to the heart of the, you know, what I hear you asking is, well, this argument is interesting, but how do you apply it in order to pluralize the conversation and to take the sort of monopoly over these questions away from a very special singular constituency that wants to use the discourse of religious freedom in order to advance an agenda that is a very specific set of interests. We can call them political, religious, it doesn't matter, but a very specific set of norms about how people should live together, whether that includes, you know, the exclusion of people who identify in different ways in terms of gender and sexuality or any other issue. So constructing bridges, I feel like part of the question has to start at the level of civil society and the groups like MRIP who are trying to open a space for a new conversation and provide tools to educate the public more broadly about how complex this is. So just the fact that you were saying these groups that are coming into the OAS under the flag of religious freedom, they are doing the following. That right there is already so much to explain to someone who might otherwise say, religious freedom is a good thing, and of course we should always support it. And these groups are drawing on the Bible, for example. How could we oppose them? So the idea might not be to push too hard, but rather to say, look, what do I mean under the flag of? What if there are other alternative understandings of how we should live together that also treasure solidarity, freedom, community, and human life and diversity and flourishing, but that aren't traveling under that flag? How do we find the words to express those alternatives? How do we bring people together around them? How do we say, look, those who are flying that flag of freedom, they may actually be using this discourse, which has got an incredibly powerful history, let's face it, right? It's very evocative to many people. People love to talk about religious freedom, and they will tell you they support it automatically. And when those people who are flying that flag, they are rallying this powerful history, and many of the religious authorities, the expert religion, they're behind them. And many of the people say, well, I guess I'll follow. But what if you groups like MRIP and others create a space where a different set of flags are flown, maybe not just one, but maybe several, that are creating spaces for all kinds, like I said, diversity, human flourishing, forms of sociality and solidarity that are meaningful and that connect people in meaningful ways with each other, with their God, etc. This is not a secular or non-theistic or atheistic discourse. This is a space that is open. And if we can create an attraction to those spaces among everyday ordinary people, the lived religion people, and say, look, do those people who carry that religious freedom flag, do they really speak for the people that you admire and the ways of life that you want to pass on to your children, and the kinds of societies that are caring and are supportive of the vulnerable, and all of those characteristics that so many people will relate to as being the kind of person we want to be. If you can create that space, I think that's where the real action is to sort of break down the monopoly, chip away at the sense that it is only religious freedom, or it's nihilism or atheism or whatever the nasty thing of the day is. Communism, if you're in our country, it's silly, but you know, really to create those spaces. And so I think it's important to come at this not with a top-down attitude, but with a very much, we're all equals on this playing field. And let's try to understand what is actually being called for by these groups before we rush to support them. Let's think about it, and let's take into account people's experiences that may not normally get to speak at the OAS. What about your cousin or your friend or your grandmother or your auntie who may never have a chance to speak at the OAS, but may have lots of ideas about what it means to live together as a society in a way that is meaningful and hopeful and expresses the forms of solidarity, whether they express that in a Christian register or not. They might not. Whatever it is, to welcome those views and to listen to those views, rather than rushing to back necessarily those who are speaking in the name of expert religion and speaking in the name of, I think, forms of power and hierarchy that we know are very gendered, that we know are discriminatory against people who identify differently in terms of gender, sexuality, that we know can cause a lot of harm. And so that's a short answer to a very rich and difficult question.
Yeah, but it's a challenge, actually. It's like how to integrate all these voices together. And as you say, it's like to create a wide range of people, not only a monopoly of some voices only. So
Exactly.
let's talk about your next project. You are currently working on a new book about the American border and political theology. So can you tell us more about that? What are the borders you are interested in, and how can borders be reinterpreted in these pandemic times, especially? Because maybe now it's gonna shift a little your book.
It is, everything is in flux right now, of course. You know, I think that even as we know that the pandemic is a horrible, horrible affliction on so many people, particularly first responders and medical workers, and those who have no choice but to leave their homes to do their jobs. It is also a moment of enormous potential for transformation. And just yesterday, in doing some reading for my project, which is about the American border and how Americans think about the border and how that influences American politics and foreign policy. As I was doing research for that, I was reading an article about a group that is self-organized in one of the border towns in Sonora in northern Mexico. And this group is a very poor community. They don't have any medical care. They have no hospital. There's nowhere for women to give birth in this community. And as people are falling ill, they have to be sent to even as far away as Nogales, which is on the northern border with Arizona, between Arizona and Sonora. And so this group, mainly women, started to self-organize, and they actually have taken down some of the roadblocks that were preventing them from moving into one of the other communities nearby that has good medical care. And they've also succeeded in preventing the American tourists from coming down from the US. So the Mexicans are closing the border to us, to the Americans. And in part led by these civil society groups, led many times by women who are speaking out and saying, this is not right. We don't want the COVID positive people coming down to go to parties and passing through our town, which is very modest and doesn't have any tourist attractions, but nonetheless is on the way to another town where it's an attraction for the Americans to go. We are going to stand up for ourselves. We are going to fight. And so there's a sense in which it's not at all the case that humans live with borders. That's who we are. We're not going to get rid of the border. We're not going to get rid of all borders. But it's also the case that borders can be navigated and negotiated so differently depending on the context. And this particular context of the pandemic is presenting some of the communities of northern Mexico with a very interesting opportunity to turn the tables on the Americans and say, well, this is a taste of your own medicine. Why don't you just stay home, because our numbers are lower here and we don't want you to come here, even though you may have some tourist dollars to spend. So that's just a quick anecdote. Obviously, I'm looking, because I like to think big, because I think that's fun, I'm looking at some really big questions around, for just to name one example, US support for Israel. And how, in a sense, it is almost as if the American border is suspended when it comes to Israel, and Israel is just part of the US. And how does that, a particular political theology, or border theology as I'm calling it, facilitate this understanding? Because there's a sense in which, and this is the central paradox of the book, the US has a very strong and fortified border. We all know about that. And it's also at times borderless. So certain economic actors, certain wealthy people, when it comes to support for Israel, there are different moments in the bordering process in the US. So there's both a presence and an absence of the border simultaneously. And I don't think it's quite so easy to explain it away with class, although, it's tempting to go down the Marxist road. I don't think it's only the material interest. I think there's something much bigger that I'm trying to get at, wrestling with political theology and questions of sacrality that are tied into the American project, that allow the border to be this very ambivalent and paradoxical space. And so I'm thinking about some of those issues right now with this project.
So we are looking forward to it.
Thank
to read you soon.
Me too.
So this is my last question, because we're supposed to welcome you at a conference and share other academic events with you in Chile next September. So unfortunately, that is not happening because of the pandemic that changed everything and our plans. But when the times permits it, hopefully, we are going to welcome you in Chile. So I know that this is going to be your first time to travel there. So what are you expecting of the visit? What would you like to learn about religion and politics in Chile, or about other issues? Whatever, maybe food, maybe museums, maybe people, I don't know.
I am so excited to come on this trip. I can't tell you how grateful I am to him for making it possible. And I'm looking forward to listening. I mean, I have traveled all over the world, but I have never been to Chile. I have never really traveled in South America, with the exception of 2 rather brief trips to Brazil. And I am very much looking forward to listening and to learning more about Chilean history and politics. And of course, religion is a part of that. And I always have an ear for thinking about the ways in which religion, culture, history, and politics played out historically with Chile's colonial history, and much more into the past century. I would be very curious to learn Chilean perspectives on US foreign policy in the region, which I have taught about and read about, but have never engaged substantively with Chilean scholars and people about their perspectives. And so I look forward to learning and listening. And also I am a gourmand, as the French say. I love to try the local cuisines. And so I'm very much looking forward to tasting the local dishes. And I like to come home afterwards and try to make them myself with my daughters, who like to bake a lot. And so during the pandemic, we do a lot of baking. And so I'm looking forward to that, and to meeting everyone and experiencing what Santiago has to offer.
Yeah, so great. Yeah, so we're expecting that. Let's hope that it's happening soon. So thank you, Beth, very much for your time. It was a great conversation, I think.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
So we welcome you to Chile, but also we are inviting people to listen the next videos, the next interviews, on the other ones that we already recorded.
Wonderful.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.